So just before we start, because we all kind of came in at different times, let's just take 20 seconds or so just to pause and relax, take a few big breaths and let go and just kind of settle in. Okay, thank you. I recognize that this is your lunch and learn, so I appreciate you taking the time to be with us today for this series. So I just want to acknowledge the land that we are standing on today, that we live on, and I'd like to read this to you. Together we acknowledge Indigenous people on whose ancient and sacred land we live, work, and play. As a community, we recognize the ever-present systemic inequities that stem directly from past wrongdoings, and we commit ourselves indefinitely to respecting and reconciling this long history of injustice. And I would like to ask, would somebody like to read this as well, a second reader, while we reflect? You could just unmute and if you'd like to read.
I would love to read it.
Thanks, Teresa.
Together we acknowledge Indigenous peoples on whose ancient and sacred land we live, work, and play. As a community, we recognize the ever-present systemic inequalities that stem directly from past wrongdoings, and we commit ourselves to indefinitely respecting and reconciling this long history of injustice.
Thank you. And you'll see a Wabanaki map in the day, the Confederacy, that's available for future for you to look at and study further. Thanks. So the mission of MERBN is to educate folks about adverse childhood experiences and, more importantly, how we together can build resilience through protective factors such as positive relationships. And that's very core at your work, right? Supporting parents and babies and healthy relationships and advocating. So I'm really grateful for what you do. We do work across all sectors, and with you folks, we're supporting your work and the state WIC program to become trauma informed and responsive as an organization. I know some of you may be doing this work internally, but we're going to be focusing on learnings that help support being trauma informed and moving towards trauma responsive. Thank you. So the purpose of today's training is to understand the foundations of trauma and what it means to be trauma informed. We'll talk about the 6 principles of trauma informed care and understand ways to create compassionate, trauma responsive environments for staff and clients. So I'd like to now, like I said, excuse me, again, we are very, very grateful for your work. You folks are wonderful in what you do to serve children and families. So at this time, I'd like to turn it to Ruby Parker. Thank you, Ruby.
Yeah, great. Thank you, guys. And we do have a poll, I think, if the poll works. Sam, were you able to launch that?
It is not working right now. I apologize.
That is quite all right. Not a problem at all. And all I was just going to do is kind of just assess everyone's feeling comfortability with understanding trauma, how trauma impacts the brain, and trauma-informed services. Sometimes it's nice just to get a lay of the land. However, you know, we've got a short time today, so I'm just going to move through and help you guys just understand that. So the first couple of slides for some of you guys might feel really familiar. You might have already seen some of this or understand some of it, but it's really important when we talk about trauma that we all have some baseline understanding. So for those of you who feel like, I know this, I'm super comfortable with that, that's wonderful. This will just be a refresher. And for those of you who are new to it, this will be a good kind of real basic understanding. What is trauma and how does that impact the brain? And then we'll move right into what does it mean to be trauma informed? So When we talk about defining trauma, there's a lot of different definitions out there. I'm using SAMHSA's definition, and a lot of them center around the similar themes, which is that trauma can result from an event, so a single event, and it can also have a series of events. But it's all about what it's perceived to be to the individual. So it's perceived to be harmful or life-threatening. The feelings that you have from the event are have a lasting effect on the individual, and it can really impact their functioning and overall well-being. It also overwhelms our system, overwhelms the capability to cope, and that's a key piece to this. So SAMHSA defines it as the 3 E's. And you'll see throughout the presentation, we've got lots of 3s and 4s and 6s. We've got numbers along the way that are going to help us try to remember some of this stuff. So SAMHSA defines it looking at it's an event, and it's how is that experienced by the individual, and what are the effects on the individual's functioning, mental, physical, and social, emotional well-being. There's lots of different types of trauma. So this is also the amount of the experience of what that trauma is, when it happens for someone in terms of the course of their life, really depends on how much it's going to have an impact on them. And like I said, it can be a single event or a series. So a single event might be something along the lines of a car accident, the loss of a relative or family or a loved one. It could also be something like a natural disaster. Usually, for the most part, that's a single event, but can have a lot of traumatic feelings that go with it. It can also be a series of events. And so that might be something like being bullied over a period of time. The last form of trauma is looking at complex trauma. And complex trauma is different because it's actually a series of those traumatic experiences that are invasive and interpersonal and often have a pervasive effect on an individual. And what it can do is actually break down an individual's sense of self. And it can impact, especially when we're talking about children, complex trauma actually can impact their development. So the important thing when we think about trauma and brains and children, sometimes when we hear this and we're talking about adverse childhood experiences or trauma, we kind of think, okay, someone has a rough life and they maybe make some bad decisions because of that experience. But the really important thing to realize is that this is actually, there's structural changes within inside our brain when children experience this. And so it's not actually choices that people are making. It can be a biological response to the environment that a child is raised in. And so when we talk about children's brains, children are actually born with over 1 billion brain cells. And over time, those brain cells start to adapt to learn their environment. So you can see on the screen here on the left-hand side, when children are first born, they have you can look at those, they're actually kind of look like branches. And those are the connections, the synaptic density of our brain cells. So how close together are those brain cells? And you can see there's not a lot there. They're pretty far away, they're not touching. And that's because when we're first born, we don't need to do a whole lot. But as we develop, as we go into early elementary age, what we see is that children's brains are full of incredible experiences. In fact, around this age, children have 3 times more synaptic connections. So they're processing information 3 times faster than adults are. And that's the reason why we see kids kind of running around. And some people might be like, oh my gosh, that kid is going crazy. And that's because inside their brain, they actually have so many connections. Every experience that they've had stays with them. But over time, we can't stay like that. We can't function in that space. And so what we see is that our brains actually do a process called pruning, where they kind of cut back on certain brain connections that they believe won't be necessary through life. It's a process. Our brains are adaptive to our environment. They're experience dependent. And so the experiences we have are the experiences our brain connections are going to keep in mind of saying, these are things I might need to know later on. So what that means for toxic stress is that if a lot of those experiences early on are in the form of toxic stress, meaning ongoing repeated exposure to abuse or neglect, it actually shifts how our brain functions, because our brain believes that we're going to need to be in survival mode on a constant basis. And if we need to survive, then the connections that our brain keeps are connections for survival, not connections necessarily for growth and learning and processing. And stress is can be a positive thing in our life, but not when that stress becomes so overwhelming that the brain doesn't have time to recover and doesn't have somebody to help them process that information. And so what we actually see on brain scans are that children who've experienced toxic stress early in life, you can see that there's actually a space within inside the brain that isn't developing and connecting the same way. It's our cross-brain communication. So oftentimes we say to children, when they're frustrated or upset, we might say, use your words. And the reality is children who've experienced toxic stress or trauma, they actually have a problem making the connection on the side of their brain between thinking about their emotions and verbalizing what that means. So when we say to people, use your words, that's actually could be a very challenging thing. It takes longer for that processing to happen. It doesn't mean it can't happen. It simply means we have to recognize that the brain's processing of information works differently in different brains. So what does a brain that experiences toxic stress look like? It's going to have, that brain is going to have a difficult time relaxing. It's going to always be on alert because it believes that there is potentially going to be danger at any point. So it's always scanning for threats. I kind of think of, there's a part of our brain called the amygdala, which is the part of our brain that scans for threat. And I think of that a little bit like a guard at Buckingham Palace. It stands very still and very straight, and it is always on alert. And the minute it senses fear, it kicks into gear. But when that happens, our brains aren't learning. We're not working. We're not able to process information because when we're in fight or flight mode, when we're in a survival because we perceive threats, that part of our brain takes over the rest of our brain. And it really blocks our ability to process new information, to communicate effectively, to regulate our emotions. And so brains that are under stress on a regular basis are going to have a harder time processing that information. And I've talked a lot about trauma and adverse childhood experience and kind of what happens in that early point inside the home. But we also have to remember sometimes that those threats can be coming from our environment. And especially right now, when we think about the challenges that so many families are facing during this pandemic, we see a lot more stress in people's lives, which can be part of their traumatic experience. So what does trauma look like? What are some signs that we may see when we think of trauma? And it's going to look different. Just because I've written these for you, it doesn't mean that if you see this, for sure there is trauma happening. These are just some signs and some behaviors that may be reflected in people who've experienced trauma. So young children may have a difficult time forming attachment. They might have excessive fear and separation. As children get older, we might see aggressive behaviors, reenacting that type of experience that they had. As children get even older and we move into adolescence, there may be anxiety and depression, intense feelings of guilt, anger, or shame. And we also start to see at that point an adoption of a negative viewpoint. And so their overall view of the world might be very negative, a sense of hopelessness. And in adults, it can look similar in those different things. We also know that in adults, there are actually certain groups of children and families that disproportionately experience trauma over others. And that can come from a number of different situations or experiences that they've had. And what we see in adults is they might have a difficult time concentrating. They might be angry or irritable or have mood swings, intense feelings of guilt or anger or shame. And again, that same negative viewpoint of the people around them or society, really feeling just disconnected or numb. They might engage in unhealthy relationships or have a hard time kind of making the connection between the choices they make and the consequences that may come from it. Again, remember that these are not decisions that people are making. that when we see that type of trauma built over the course of their childhood and into adulthood, what we see is that these are actually biological shifts inside their brain, and they need to have the ability to practice new skills to learn how to not make some of those same actions or repeat those same behaviors. And so what you guys know from past trainings you've had and from what we've just talked about is that there is a number of different impacts that trauma has on the individual, and it can result in a number of different lifelong outcomes that include their ability to earn proper wages and their ability to live a healthy lifestyle, their sense of adapting chronic conditions such as cancer. And so what we see is across the span of a lifetime, a number of different outcomes that are negatively impacted by trauma and adverse childhood experiences. So now that we have a good understanding of kind of what happens inside the brain, I went through that pretty quickly because most of you guys probably know some of that, you maybe know all of it. We want to move into what does it mean to be trauma informed? And so these are considered the 4 R's of trauma-informed care. This is our way of looking at what are the different things we need to consider when we want to be trauma-informed. And the first thing is to realize. And so these, the 4 R's of trauma-informed care are for both organizations and for individuals. So that's where we're going to move here. So we have to have individuals and an organization realize that there's a widespread impact of trauma and understand the potential paths for recovery. So that's the realization. The recognition is actually recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma, both in the people who we work with on a daily basis, in families, and then also in staff amongst one another and our colleagues. And then be able to respond to that trauma through our different policies, procedures, and practices. And then the last R within trauma-informed care is to resist re-traumatization. And this is a really key one because even if we think we're kind of making shifts, we understand the different ways in which our current policies may need to be shifted, we always have to be looking at, are we re-traumatizing people? And that includes both staff and with adults. The key with trauma-informed care is that this is not a checkbox. This is not an assessment you take once and you've checked off your boxes and you realize, oh great, we're now trauma-informed. As I move through today, you'll see everything I'm going to talk about is this is a process of constant reevaluation, reviewing policies, making changes, reassessing people's learning in order to really have that type of an impact and move towards trauma-informed care. This is a process, and I'm going to help kind of outline some of the steps along that roadmap. So there are 6 guiding principles when we talk about trauma-informed care. And these are the different things that are going to are fundamental to any sort of a trauma-informed approach. And so in order for us to follow along that process, these 6 things need to be considered kind of at every step of the way. And the first one is safety. The key here is safety is both psychological and physical safety. And it needs to be prioritized for both the staff and for the people who we serve. The other thing too is that safety should be defined by those who we are serving. It should not be defined by kind of top leadership. So we need to be allowing opportunities for that to be practiced and to be voiced. The second guiding principle is trustworthiness and transparency. And so that's looking at, does the organization, the business, the people who we work with, is there a dedication to conduct our work with transparency and in order to build trust amongst the people who we work with. The third guiding principle is on peer support. And this model here should be looking at, are we allowing opportunities for people's stories and people who have lived experiences to share that with one another and help promote self-healing amongst one another. For adults, that could be working with someone else who's experienced trauma. And for children, it might be having a family, working with family members who've also experienced trauma. The fourth step is collaboration and mutuality. And so this is looking at the role that everyone plays within a trauma-informed approach. And so the important thing that when we talk about trauma-informed care is oftentimes someone might say, oh, well, we've done a training, and so therefore we have started to have this conversation and we understand. And if we want to have full collaboration, we want to be sure that everybody has access to the same information from every level of staff, all the way down to the people who we work with on a daily basis. So as an organization, when we move towards trauma-informed care, we also are evaluating power differentials and focusing on that healing really happens within relationships. And there's an expert who once said that we don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. And that's where we see collaboration is sharing that experience. And the fifth step in this is empowerment and voice. And so this is looking at recognizing that people's individual strengths and experiences should be built upon throughout the whole organization. That organizations understand there's a need for support. They're recognizing power differentials between staff and the people they serve, or even amongst staff, and offering ways that participants who have historically been unheard, that their voices are allowed to be heard and that they help guide the work that we do. And the last principle here of trauma-informed care is the recognition of cultural, historical, or gender issues. And this is actively moving past cultural stereotypes and biases. It's offering access to culturally and gender-specific and responsive services. It's leveraging the healing value of traditional cultural connections. And then incorporating all of that into policies, practical processes, protocols that recognize and address historical trauma. So one way that re-traumatization looks within the workplace or within systems is kind of this gives us a good way of looking at what does this look like. So re-traumatization, which was, remember, one of those 4 R's of how do we move past that into the trauma-informed approach, is recognizing our policies and procedures, the way things are done, might unintentionally be causing people re-traumatization. So, for instance, having people having to retell their story or fill out new forms every time they interact with someone within the organization. Recognizing that if we have specific diagnoses or labels that are attached to people, being mindful that that is not who they are as a person, but that's something that they have with it, using a person-focused language when we're talking to people. You know, this happens at a system level, but it also happens at an individual relationship level between the people who they work with. So the system has a way of sometimes re-traumatizing them in the way that we've always worked this way, and this is how we have to process our paperwork or take our intake, but also looking at the relationship, ensuring that the relationship between the clients or the participants that we work with and the staff, that they're being seen and heard, that they feel like there's a sense of trust, that they're being offered opportunities to be collaborative in the treatment plans or the service plans that they receive, and recognizing that we need to shift away from kind of punitive treatment or language that might make a client feel like they've done wrong. So when we're looking to implement trauma-informed approaches, there's a series of different questions that we can look at to shift our practices. And so I'm going to run through some of those different bigger categories. There's a lot more of these questions. There's actually full assessments that you can take if you are interested in really moving towards a trauma-informed organization. And so these are just kind of highlighting some of the different things that you might want to look at when you're talking about trauma-informed care. So the first ones, and there's actually 10 different categories. I'm only going to cover some of them. But one of the ones I think is really important is looking at our policies. And this is something that I know some of you guys have already started on this process, which is fantastic. But it's looking at how do the agency's written policies and procedures recognize the pervasiveness of trauma in the lives of people who are using those services? And how do they express a commitment to reducing re-traumatization and promoting well-being and recovery? An example of what this might look like is the language specifically on intake forms. Are we recognizing the different types of families and individuals who come through our doors and being very inclusive with that? Another thing, when we think back to those 6 principles of trauma-informed care, the first one is safety, physical and psychological safety. And so our physical environment is a key place where we can look at how do we address that? And so does the physical environment promote a sense of safety? Is it calming? Does it actually create a sense of de-escalation for participants and for our staff? So that's the other thing you're going to notice when I'm talking about trauma-informed care. This is about the work we do with our participants, but it's also about the way we treat our colleagues and the other people within our organization. And so examples of what this might look like is, do the pictures on your wall represent all families? Is there enough space between chairs? And I know right now the physical space is not being utilized in the same way, probably for many of you. And obviously physical space is being kept a distance because of COVID, but also that's a way too to promote safety, physical safety for individuals who might have experienced trauma, and the physical space that feels packed and crowded can be triggering for some. The other thing is to look at our lighting. You know, do we have really clinical lights? Can we do something to try to make that feel a more inviting, calming space? I've seen examples of this being where they took, they had overhead, I'm blanking on the like, you know, typical office lighting, and they used different color stickers, like transparent stickers that were brightly colored over the different lights to create a cool, calming environment. And that's another great way of saying we have a space. We can't make big shifts to what that physical space looks like based off budget, but we can do something to create a calming environment for the clients and for our staff. So another place to look at for implementation is engagement and involvement. How do people who with lived experience have the opportunity to provide feedback? Is there a questionnaire that they can fill out, comment boxes available? How do you promote transparency across your policies, but also without kind of being an information overload? You know, you want to be transparent, but sometimes dumping a bunch of policies in someone's lap and saying, oh, these are our policies, we want you to know about it. That could also be very overwhelming for someone who's experienced trauma. And so being really mindful of a way, how do we promote this, but we also are respectful and we resist the urge to re-traumatize. Another area of looking at it as for a whole organization is through cross-sector collaboration. So are we collaborative? Are our collaborative and referral partners, for instance, are they trauma informed? And are we purposely working with people who we think share some of the same values as us? And so that could be inviting some of your referral partners or collaborative partners into your space to offer them the same access to training, which I know today, for instance, we're so grateful that you guys were able to invite others, which is really a great way to start that process of saying it's important for not only us as an individual organization or for all of the different WIC offices and organizations who work with WIC to be trauma informed, but we're going to invite those who we refer to. Another thing too is, is there a possibility to collect feedback from participants to share what experience did they have when they went to a referral source? I think that's a really important way to recognize we don't want to put our clients, our participants in a space where they might be re-traumatized when we tell them to go someplace else. Screening and assessment. This is a big one too, of looking at how is it in the collaboration aspect of trauma-informed principles, how is an individual's own definition of emotional safety being included in treatment plans? So are we asking participants what is important to them? Are there options for gender-specific trauma services if we identify that that's something that's important or needed for the participant? And the last area of implementation that I'm going to talk about in this space here of specific examples is training and workforce development. And like I said earlier, trauma-informed care is not a checkbox. It's not just one assessment we do. It's an ongoing process. And so training and workforce development is a really key way for us to continue to ensure that all staff are receiving offerings of trainings. They're being included in opportunities to discuss what's our impact and our strategies. And the other piece of this too is, are we recognizing self-care and the impact of secondary trauma in the trainings that we offer for staff? Because many times when we have staff who work with those who've experienced trauma, there's a greater sense of secondary trauma for staff. Additionally, trauma is not just something that happens to those people or to some people. This is something that we all experience. In fact, when we talk about ACEs and in past trainings you guys had, I know you've talked about the fact that ACEs are incredibly common. These are not something that's just happening to some people. And so staff have also probably experienced ACEs or trauma and might need some of that same trauma responsive services that we're offering to others. So I want to take a moment and I think because of time, I think it's probably best just to write in the chat box just quickly. Just if you have any examples of some of the things I've just run through that your office has already done to make some of these changes, or you're in the process of doing it, you know, if it's about your physical space, if you've made a recognition, if you've changed any of your policies, why don't you guys just take a moment and write that in the chat box and share that with others. I know you guys are representing people, WIC offices all across the state. And so not everyone in the room might be aware of some of the practices and changes that have happened. And it's great. I'm just pulled up the chat and I noticed someone mentioned that they didn't even know that there was a choice in light bulbs until they recently went to order and install it. And that's one of those things too, of stopping and thinking about like, oh, could we make a change to our physical space that would be more inviting to people? That's great. So if anyone has any other examples and they want to write that into the chat of what kind of changes they have seen in their office, or maybe not even changes, maybe it's something you've been doing all along, but that speaks to some of those different implementation practices I just spoke to. All right. Anyone have, and if someone wants to unmute rather, they are welcome to do that.
This is Ginger from State Agency. I guess I can start. We're going to have Keeney look at all of our state policies to ensure inclusion. We were trying to get through state plan updates, and that's done. And so we're going to be doing a review of our policies to make sure that race, gender, and sexual orientation are treated equally in all of the state agency policies. So you'll see those if there's any changes in the state plan updates that we share with you in July.
Thank you so much for sharing, Ginger. That's a great example of starting that process and moving towards a trauma-informed workplace. All right, well, we're going to move along. It's quite all right if no one else is interested in sharing. Thank you so much, Ginger, for stepping up. And we're going to just move into a little bit more on ways that we make workplaces move towards trauma-informed care. The big thing with trauma-informed care is it invites us to move away from us versus them and acknowledge that we're all in this together. So it's, like I've said, I've kind of repeated this, it's just as much about the people who we work with as it is about our staff, our colleagues, our friends, and really creating environments where all people thrive. And so if we want to move towards that space, we also have to be really mindful of stigma and being aware of our own prejudice. We're going to have a training later in this series focus on bias and understanding microaggressions, which is going to be a great space for us to start to focus and recognize what might our own judgments and stigmas come to the table. And so the other space that we can do this is to educate ourselves. And so the trainings you guys are attending are a great space to do that. And having conversations about this outside of these trainings. So I encourage people to be really vulnerable and say, you know, I didn't think about my own prejudice. I didn't really think that. One way you can do it, I've seen an example of this, is where you practice where for one day, you simply take note of every single time you kind of jump to a conclusion about someone you saw walking down the street, someone's voice you heard on the other end of a telephone. Just really be mindful and focus on what kind of conclusions might I have jumped to, and why did I have those feelings or those thoughts come to mind. It's something that we all have in us, and we have to work on recognizing them and moving past them. So like I've said, trauma-informed is not necessarily a linear process for people, but there are kind of phases, a roadmap towards trauma-informed care. And as Ginger just spoke about, and all the work that the State WIC office is doing, they are in the process of moving towards a trauma-informed organization. And I'm guessing that almost everyone here in the room, the organizations you guys work for, are going to probably fall somewhere in that phase 2, phase 3, and maybe even into the phase 4. Trauma-informed care is a process that takes a while to get there, and it's a continual process. We never kind of say, great, we can sit back. We've now reached trauma-informed care and we don't need to do anything else. It's a process. So I'm just going to kind of highlight, what does it mean to be trauma responsive and what does it mean to be trauma informed, those last 2 phases on that process. And so what you'll see, I'm going to just go back to here, is that trauma aware is that simple recognition awareness that we need to recognize trauma. We know it's there, but we don't really know much. Trauma sensitive is once we start to have foundational knowledge, we have trainings built into the work we're doing. We feel as an agency we're ready to make change, and we've started to kind of look at what's our process, our current process and infrastructure for change to happen. So those first 2 phases, my guess is that in the work we are doing through these different trainings and the work that people have done within their own organization, we're probably moving out from phase 2 into phase 3. And for some of you, you might even be beyond that. So trauma responsive is that organizations, like I said, they've already built their awareness, they've already established there's a readiness for change, and they're starting to identify opportunities for trauma-informed changes. Policies are being reviewed and practices, and there's starting to be a practice towards new policies. So there's a process in place for feedback and input from both staff and from our participants. There might be a work group who's decided that they're going to be the ones to kind of gather this information and be able to share and identify where are there gaps, where do we need to be doing more work. And trauma-informed is that we're actually, I just realized I didn't change this from trauma-aware to trauma-informed, excuse me. But trauma-informed is that we're actually implementing those new practices and policies now. So trauma-informed is where we've said we understand what trauma is. We have an ability for all staff to have that foundational knowledge on a continual basis. We have looked at our policies. We understand there's needs to be change. We've changed those policies. And now we're actually in the process of practicing those new policies. There's actually a culture change that feels there's safety, there's empowerment, there's trustworthiness, it's welcoming. So that culture shift has happened within the organization. And this process is an ongoing process. There has to be, what you'll see here with trauma-informed, there's an implement and monitoring process of trauma-informed care where we're assessing how are we doing. and constantly reevaluating those changes we've made to see, are they meeting the mark, or do we need to make more changes possibly? And so we're making those changes and modifying them as needed in order for us to continually be on the path towards trauma-informed care. So if we're being trauma-informed, if that's the goal and that's where we're working towards, it's really important also for us to have resilience and healing built into our organizations. And so this is a definition for those of you who partook in Keeney's first training in the spring. This definition is the definition that Mervyn uses when we talk about resilience. And resilience is the capacity of a system to adapt under difficult circumstances. And so a system can be big, like an organization, or even bigger than an organization, but a system is also a workplace, it's an individual, it's a family. So it's really looking at what's the capacity of any one of us or any one of our environments to adapt under difficult circumstances. And so with that definition in mind, we have to recognize that there is collective trauma happening, especially right now, in what we've all experienced over the last year, and what, not quite a year, and what our clients and the people we work with are also experiencing. And so creating resilient work cultures is a really important step in the process towards trauma-informed care. And so these are just some of the tips that you can do. A big one here, you noticed, and earlier I mentioned encouraging self-care and care for others and taking frequent breaks. And so again, this is just as much about the staff and the workplace as it is about also helping the people who we work with. It's also about providing education and info and resources within the workplace for staff, figuring out a way to mitigate vicarious trauma amongst staff, taking a look at the ways that we provide supervision and one-on-one touch points with our colleagues, and really looking at how are we building resilience into every aspect of the work that we do. And so you can see this is another way of looking at how do we move along that process. And so this cuts out the different steps of trauma-informed care, and it looks at saying, one way is really organizations who have not taken any of this into account. They're not recognizing that there's trauma. And in fact, they might be trauma-inducing. And so that's what we consider a trauma-organized culture. A trauma-informed culture is moving towards all the things we've talked about today, of operating from the foundational understanding of the nature and impact of trauma. We have shared language, we have a shared understanding, we're evaluating processes and ensuring that we create safe spaces for all. But the last phase of this is, how do we become a healing organization? So how do we actually shield individuals from trauma and reduce the trauma that they may experience within our organization and when they leave our doors? And so this healing organization process is a bigger step. And I think that when we talk about trauma-informed care, it's important to also think about how are we being healing and resilient. And the rest of the different series and trainings that we're going to offer over the course of the next several months, I think will help create that healing organization principles and practices for all of you. So if any one of you now feels like we see where we're at in those step-by-step processes of being trauma-informed, and we want to continue that process, we want to continue progress towards being a trauma-informed organization, these are just some simple steps of organizational planning that would take you along those processes. And so the first step is the commitment to make change. So when you think back to the roadmap towards trauma-informed care, that's the readiness. What's the readiness within our organization or agency to make change? And then the next thing is to identify a change team. So it's hard for this work to happen. It's probably impossible for this work to happen by a single person trying to steer the ship. And it's also hard sometimes to make change when it's big and everything is changing all at once. And so creating a change team or an action can help create an action plan of what are the different steps we want to take a look at. As you heard Ginger share earlier, one thing that the state WIC office is doing is looking at their policies and making shifts within their policies, or just recognizing, are our policies using the right language? Are we being inclusive of all people who we work with, and starting that process of just taking a moment to recognize that, and that's part of an action plan that they're working towards. I've said it many times and I'll stress it again, implementing trainings, but for all staff. I so often see organizations, and I'm so grateful that there's so many of you here with me today to have this conversation, but I so often see trainings only being offered, for instance, to direct service personnel, and maybe leadership doesn't partake in it, that's can be really challenging with people's schedules. The great thing with the world that we're in right now is we have the opportunity to allow more people to partake in that. So are we really ensuring that every person who we work with on a day-to-day basis has opportunities to have that training? There are lots of agency assessments out there. Keeney and I at Mervyn have access to many of those different agency assessments. We would be happy to share them. You can also find them in a couple of different resources. We've shared some of those in our handouts for you that I believe Sam has already sent or will be sending to you all.
Yeah, I will be. We only have a minute left, and I don't want anyone to get kicked off. I apologize
that is fine.
Yeah, with the delay in the presentation, but I just wanted to thank you. And I know you have another slide with your contact information, but I can send those out to everybody. And everybody, if you have any questions, feel free to email me, and I can get them to Ruby and Kinney, and we can get you guys some answers, or we can elaborate a little bit more at our next meeting. Oh, it looks like we didn't get kicked off. I thought we were going to get kicked off right at 12. So this is great.
That's perfect. Thank you guys all so much. Sam has my presentation to share with you guys all. So any questions, feel free to reach out to us, and we're looking forward to seeing you all in a month for another training.
And hey, this is Ginger. Don't hang up yet. We're having a problem with Spirit, and we've had to bounce the server. So go take a break, and the server, we're hoping everybody will be able to log back in by 1 o'clock. I've just sent you an email to your work address, WIC staff, and I will update that as fast as I can if I can get you back in before 1 o'clock. We're really sorry. Sanford's down, so we're trying to bring them back up. Sorry about that, guys.
Thank you all. It was great.
Great. Thank you all. Have a
Thank
great
you
day,
all.
everyone.